Okay, so let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining my session today at M365 California. And it's my pleasure to present you a session today with everything you ever wanted to know about external sharing in Microsoft 365. And really, so, with Microsoft 365, as most of you might be aware, that it's, consists of variety of workloads. So we'll be looking at a variety of things like SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, some aspects of Microsoft 365 groups, and also just really kind of understanding how best to bring all those experiences together from the perspective of planning, how best to enable your external sharing. And now whether that's guest access, external sharing, and there's different terminologies used depending on which documentation you read. But we'll, I'll kind of, make sure that's all clear so that we can understand exactly the journey that one has to make. And, more importantly, just, in which order you might want to consider switching some of the things on and off as well. So with that, just wanted to say a big thanks to Galen, Ryan, Joel, and many others who's helped out to organize this event. And without their sheer efforts, this obviously events like these just would not be possible. So really appreciate and a big thanks from me to all you guys. And yeah, so it's kind of a pleasure to be here. And obviously not forgetting the sponsors. Without them, of course, some of these events would not be funded in some ways. So if you haven't come across them, then please do check them out. And I'm sure you're going to see this slide throughout the day as well. So, but yeah, no, please do visit those. For those of you who are not aware of, I'm Chirag Patel. I live and work in London, UK, and work with Patel Consulting as a Microsoft 365 consultant, and really kind of work in various capacities, wearing multiple hats as an architect, hands-on engineer, or even training, albeit mainly in SharePoint and some aspects of Teams as well. But really kind of been around for about 20 odd years. Started off as DBA, SharePoint, and really kind of just worked my way from as an end user administrator, as well as being consultant in working in variety of organizations, and also many UK Microsoft partners. But in terms of trying to keep up to date with a lot of things that goes around with Microsoft 365, I organize and run Microsoft 365 UK user group. And so that's a monthly event that I run with two speakers from the community. And the next one is on the 17th of February. So it'd be good if you can join. And techchirag.com is my blog, and I basically all my events, the community events that I speak at, you'll find all those information there. And Tech Chirag is also through the Twitter, LinkedIn. So please feel free to connect. And if I'm able to help you out in any ways, then yeah, I'd love to do that. So in aside from obviously kind of speaking side of things, but also these are some of the events over the years I've spoken at, and they're all the links over there. So do feel free to check them out. And you may be interested in some other topics that I've presented there as well. But yeah, this is pretty much my learning arena with all the friends in the community. Okay, so let's just start from this end user in terms of wherever you are, and there's this common share dialog box. Doesn't matter what team or project you're working with, or what sites in SharePoint or Microsoft Teams or even Power BI or wherever it is. The ultimately the aim here is that you want to be able to not just share things within your organization, but more and more so now being able to share externally. And there are a variety of ways of doing this. And this is obviously just grabbed a screenshot to really kind of show you that this is the kind of the maximum ways that you can try and understand to try and share that. And it's a common screen that we see all the time when we're sharing it. I've obviously got a demo tenant here that I'll be kind of going through a lot of the demo experiences. But in particular, when you have the first one, which is the anyone who can access your content, then obviously you do have lots of other options there in order to either set the expiry date or even set a password for that particular document or folder that you might be sharing anyone on the planet. But then obviously, as you work through that, you're kind of getting into a restrictive way of sharing it. So not really keeping it wide open, from people in the company, and that link can travel anywhere inside your organization. And so sometimes some organizations keep that as a default, only for the encouragement of collaboration so that people don't get access denied frequently, and also just making it sure that if one doesn't have the answer to a particular question or query, then they can just forward that shared link to somebody else in the organization so that they can still access that particular file, which is, I would say, probably by far the best way to do it, as long as we have a trusted culture in an organization where people just don't use that in a kind of any other ways. But yeah, then you got your people with direct access. So I think you probably kind of I guess some of you are familiar with that, so I won't go in that too much detail, but really kind of that's the starting premise, if you like, to just go ahead and start sharing it in terms of for your documents. But if we just take a step back in terms of how, because it's all very well easy, with few clicks, get the document sharing and so forth. But if you look at the processes and the people that you need to kind of work with, then these are some of the areas that one has to really kind of strongly consider in terms of making sure that you have kind of a full control from an IT perspective as well as from the business governance, that you can keep control of your external sharing. So, to pick a few there, training sometimes, it's not just about training on one part of the service, but also just understanding generally in conjunction with the compliance as to how best to externally share things, and with examples of those things. But also being able to align that with your information security policies, the classifying SharePoint sites or even Microsoft Teams. So for example, if it's a confidential project that you might be working on, then you want to try and make sure that nothing gets shared externally, even by accident. And so you can kind of lock those things down. So really kind of just to make sure that you know roughly what kind of inventory of your teams or sites that you're working with. And then of course you got the variety of links that you can share, because there can be a bit of confusion whether you're in SharePoint or Teams. But from a collaboration perspective, they're all joined together, so you have that one-to-one relationship. So wherever you have your Microsoft Teams chat space, there is a SharePoint site behind it as well. So inadvertently, when you share things in Teams, and we will look at this as well, as to how that looks like in SharePoint as well. So these are just things to kind of think about from how to kind of go through that. But when you kind of practically translate that into what that governance might look like, and you may very well integrate this with your existing governance plans for your Microsoft 365 or even Teams, and really kind of just looking at the balance, because if you're a small organization, you may not go through the entirety of this governance aspect of it. But if you're a large multinational, then for sure it just becomes that much of an effort to try and work out in terms of how much you can allow users to have that self-service ability to to create things like Teams or SharePoint sites with the classification in place, but also being able to then kind of control through the DLP policies as to when things get shared externally, and still be able to override if you really must share something externally. So these are the kind of controls that you can put in place, and really kind of just make sure that your content is protected, and also holding people or teams responsible for your general external sharing side of things. So again, it's a very high level view to kind of just to help you map out your journey in terms of how you kind of roll out your external sharing capabilities. But then if you look at into also go further down, drill down into that very specific line by line item, and these are just some of the examples that I use in when I come to design the policies for it. And again, a lot of it kind of looks familiar to you if you're a SharePoint administrator, but they can be different for your Teams or Microsoft 365, depending on how you do that. And really kind of just helping the users to read out, to understand exactly what you're up against when you do share externally. So, again, to pick out a couple of things there, that, IT can restrict those domains so that only they can have the users sending or sharing things into a specific company or partners out there, all the way down to having some kind of a limitations around being able to expire or prove their ownership, that they still need access to that document and not just leaving that external sharing link forever out there. So you can have those things expiring as well. So again, this might help you when you do put some kind of policies in place and being able to then work through with your either change management or with IT or within the business in order to bring some of those policies within that. So that's kind of just in the kind of background to kind of set the scene around what it takes to just get the external sharing started. But what we're going to be looking now through is some of the demo workloads, if you like. And then obviously Microsoft Teams seems to be kind of at the center of the universe, but obviously you do have these 5 major workloads in terms of that order of how you do things. And again, the flexibility is there, whether you decide or allow the users to just invite people from outside being able to share that content, or whether you lock it down to a specific site or even a folder or file within that. But of course, there are other additional considerations as well. So you got things like Microsoft Forms, you got those Cortana, you got Whiteboard, some of the the connected experiences that some of the information can go out through feedback or whichever it is. So we'll go through some of those as well, just to kind of give you that full picture of within that Microsoft 365, and obviously there are dependencies on that. Okay. So the logical place for to start looking at your external collaboration is from Azure, because this is your kind of the main switch. So in fact, we can just jump onto the demo straight away and go through that. So while you kind of do understand whether you want to allow it totally or not, then pretty much what you're doing here is just to control, first of all, do you want to allow external sharing? Because if you don't, you can just turn off from that particular area. So we'll be heading towards the Azure. So if I just go into portal.azure.com, and so within there, you can just go into Azure Active Directory, which I'm sure many of you is part of from an administration perspective. But once you're in there, then there's the area within external identities, external collaboration settings. And this is the main part, whether you want to just control admins to just have access who are able to invite guests. And if your policy or scenario is that you only want IT to control that, then obviously you will just have that for the admins and turn off the members not invite. So therefore only is IT controlled. You may want to have option that if you invite third party or guests, then obviously maybe they can invite their own colleagues or teammates or working with that. So you can control that as well, whether guest can invite or not. And then obviously you got something in preview here is being able to have a self-service sign up via the user flow. So that's in preview at the moment. But what's coming around in a couple of months or in March is the ability to enable emailing the one-time passcode, which is obviously more secure in that way. And you can see here the option that you can just enable that straight away without having to wait until March. But in March, that's going to be by default. And then obviously from a collaboration restriction perspective is your domains, whether you want to allow just anybody on planet to share your documents to, or whether you want to even deny specific domains. So that's that kind of change in terms of configuration for that is always been there. So this is not not new in terms of in the recent years. It's always been there. And then depending on how you've decided whether to allow or not, so then you would head over to your Microsoft 365 Admin Center. which is the next logical place to go to. So if I go there, that's fine. Yep, I don't want to make changes to that config in Azure. And then that's the only place you would go into Azure, and we will come back a bit later on for other areas of monitoring. But in the meantime, I can just head over to my settings, org settings, and then within the security and privacy, I've got my sharing there as well. So now this area will obviously control for your guests to be, whether they can be added to the organization. Now, obviously, this checkbox you see here is exactly the same as what you would see in your Azure AD just now that we had in the external collaboration setting. But again, this is one place that you can control. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar, this includes guests as in the Microsoft 365 groups. And Microsoft 365 groups is obviously that cross membership service, which not only services Microsoft Teams, but also a SharePoint site, Exchange mailbox, OneNote, all that within that. So whenever you're adding guests to your team, you're potentially giving them access to the SharePoint site and other areas of that as well. So that could be Power BI if there's a workspace for it, Dynamics, the other areas of it as well. So you have all those things to consider when you do allow the guests within that. But the good thing about, from going that further down is that and this is probably the simplest way, to give access to the guest to your entire team chat space. But if you really want to then focus down into the detail of, say, within SharePoint, because SharePoint is also part of the Microsoft Teams, then you can actually consider whether you want to have just anyone, and this is your platform for SharePoint. So this will affect all of your SharePoint sites that's attached to all those teams, or including the ones without teams, like your communication sites, for example. So here you got 4 options, either only people in the organization, and that way it'll be only just internal, or you might just want to have your existing guests. So again, if you're inviting guests, from Azure, for example, then obviously you can only use existing guests within that, or rather give users the choice to invite new as well as and the existing guests within that. So whichever the option you choose, you got that from really unrestricted way to all the way restricted to just your organization. So that's your kind of really understanding, what what that kind of who can actually come to your organization to view or edit your content. But you can go then further down within that. So at this point, we're in SharePoint Admin Center, whereby not only you're controlling the sharing for your for SharePoint, but also for OneDrive as well. And these settings are exactly the same as what we saw in our previous screen. But with SharePoint, then you can go into further detail in terms of that, whichever the permission model you choose. So if I choose, and as I'm moving this forward up and down, you can see OneDrive is also going down as well, because with OneDrive you can't have somebody on anyone, and with SharePoint lower than that. So it's always going to be higher or on higher than SharePoint will be higher than obviously OneDrive. So if I still do one SharePoint anyone, I can still say OneDrive can only be restricted to the organization. So I've got that flexibility there to control that. And just kind of cross-referencing slightly. So if we look at from a training perspective, and if you kind of really want to make sure that you want to do this in a controlled way, then one of the things you can do is allow only specific users or in security groups to share things externally from SharePoint sites. So therefore, kind of really locking it down that only people who have attended the training or who have ticked the box to say they know what they're doing from a compliance perspective or anything like that, then you can actually manage those security groups in there as well. So you can choose, for example, market project team, or there's a sales and marketing team as well. So you can say the entire group of that team can just share externally and nobody else. So you got that option there to be able to control that. And then obviously you got a few settings, just scrolling down quickly there, being able to, guests being able to sign in using the same account, because sometimes if they're using the Microsoft account, they may have a personal account and the work account with the same ID. So you want to try and make sure that only one account is used every time they sign in and not interchangeably between the two. And then obviously this is one of the key part here, people, being able to use verification code. The default there is 30 days. For some of the highly regulated organizations, they may reduce that down to say 3 days or even 5 days, so that they get prompted to be able to enter the verification code again if they want to access that content, as long as the link is still alive and still have access to that content. Okay. And then, yeah, just a couple of points there. You can then control from, again, for all your SharePoint sites, being able to understand that, you can choose what kind of links you can actually give permission. So whether by default, when you share, if everything is just view only, and then forcing the user to only check on edit if they want the person who wants to be sharing to actually edit their file or files in the folder. So there's kind of really one screen, very straightforward way in order to kind of control your entire SharePoint site of things. And then just while I'm here very quickly, I think one of the things that you can look at from, once you've kind of done the SharePoint side of things for all your sites, then you can go into your specific SharePoint sites. So, you may not want all these sites, because by default, whenever you create SharePoint site, external sharing is on. So unless you have some special scripts running that every time a site is created, you turn off the external sharing. So you may have a provisioning process or something like that. But if I had all my sites disabled for external sharing, and if I go into my site over here, then I can still control at an individual site level as well. So if I go into policies, then within policies, I can actually have, still respecting my organization level settings a couple of screens ago that we were in, but I can still override some of those things that I have. So in this case, for my project side, I don't want anyone to have access to it. So I might change that to just new and existing guests. And then also being able to still limit the domain if I wanted to for a specific partner, but also being able to change the default sharing link type, so that end user experience for the sharing dialog that they get, you can control that through for this particular site setting itself for that external sharing. So you got that flexibility all the way from the platform level all the way down to your SharePoint site itself. And really kind of that's in a nutshell from a SharePoint perspective, how you can have that almost, I call that two-layer external sharing. So you got your main SharePoint platform, and then you got the actual SharePoint site itself. And really, because that's the key part for any collaboration, is all the files and folders that goes within that. So hopefully that's kind of given you some flavors in terms of what, from SharePoint perspective, how you can control that sharing. So just going to jump back to the slides. So we kind of looked at some of the screenshots, and I've put the slides there so at least you can get the idea. So I think we were looking at some of the things earlier from the Microsoft 365 group perspective. So to bear in mind over here is that you have the ability to actually control if for a specific group for your Microsoft 365 group for a team to disable the external sharing. So that at that point, you're kind of disabling not just the SharePoint part, but the actual group, the whole team itself, because by default and coming from next month and Microsoft Teams, for example, you're going to have that guest access enabled by default. So at the moment, you can turn it on still if you wanted to, but by default, then every team that you create will have that guest access enabled. So in this case, you'll get the option to do that. But just kind of running through the slide very quickly in terms of guest, what they can, what they can't do. It's a handy link over there. You can have a look. So things like, for example, they can't create a group or another team. If you like, they can start a conversation, reply to it, and all this within itself is from a group's email perspective. and not necessarily just the team perspective, because obviously you may have a scenario where you may have a Microsoft 365 group and a set SharePoint site, but you may not necessarily say create the team associated with it. So you have that the options from a group perspective, what they can or what they can't do. So things like the calendar in there as well. So we had a look at the SharePoint side of things, found the default scopes for it, but also being able to control at the site level, and really kind of just, boils down in 4 areas. You can control who you can share it to, which external users can be shared with, as well as what can be shared, if it's anything or specific libraries within that as a site owner, if you like, and more importantly, how you can actually share those links that can be used itself. Couple of things to bear in mind is that obviously when you look at the if you compare the again from a documentation perspective, is that for your OneDrive or SharePoint, doesn't matter either of them, then you essentially got 3 types of users within that, and only SharePoint that they can access and nothing else. If you decide to choose the SharePoint route to share your files or folder, but if you on the right hand side, if you look at the guest experience, and that's your groups, or whether you create your identity and guests in the Azure itself, or for your partner kind of organizations, then really there you're not only just giving them access to the SharePoint, but also the entire workloads and the elements of that group itself. So that's your team mailbox, the calendar, notes, files, the planner plans, and all those things. And you can see, I mean, the power of Microsoft 365 group there, including Power BI and some of the applications within that. So it's a kind of a really wider coverage that you give some of the access to as a guest. In terms of the invitation management, briefly, this hasn't changed much, except that when you look at it from a SharePoint perspective, SharePoint has got its own, the actual directory of users, where it's actually having to create those entries. So compared to Azure, you creating that the guest itself through invitation, whereas in SharePoint, unless somebody has clicked on the link on the email they received to access the link, only after then you're going to have that entry recorded inside your SharePoint. And so this, invitations are generated every time when you share a file or folder. So your SharePoint site can consist of many of those itself, in terms of being able to contain all that, the users from that. So let me just show you very quickly on that what I mean by that. So if I go and pick my SharePoint, I'll go into Chirag project site. So this site I know is shared externally, and this is the document library, which is where all my the team channels that I have lives in here. So each channel that you see in your team chat space, they're all represented by a folders within the main document library called documents. So if I go into my general, sorry, not general, if I go into site settings, site permissions, and advanced permission settings. So whilst you can see, and this is the old classic look of the SharePoint site in terms of where the security lives, but if I go into here, going into one of those members, then essentially what I'm doing here, there's no easy way to get to this, but replace that with 0 in the URL, then this gives me the entire list of people who has accessed not just files or folders or anything inside, it's the whole lot inside the SharePoint site. So you can see that there is one identity here called M365 Chirag. So this had my other ID, which is M365 Chirag at gmail.com, and you can see that that's the kind of ID prefix it stores as an account identifier inside your SharePoint. So if you're a site owner and you want to check who's got access externally, then this is the kind of way to have a look in terms of your users inside your SharePoint site. The other way you can look at there is if you go into if I go back to site content, the other way you can look at is the site usage analytics. So within my SharePoint site, I can go to site usage, where I'll get all the information within there. In fact, I'm in the wrong site. My apologies. The Mark 8 project team. Yeah, different SharePoint sites. So if I go into site usage analytics, then I can also see in terms of who else is accessing the externally shared content. So whilst I got some stats over here, but if I scroll to the bottom, then I can see that there's a section here that says shared with external users. So if I do discover something in here that should have been shared at all, then obviously I can revoke that access very quickly by just going into and viewing permissions for, say, pricing guidelines itself. So in here, I've done that because all the whole folder has been shared within this within this files itself. So it's not just a file level access, but it's the whole thing. So if I wanted to just share that, stop sharing completely, then I can just stop sharing like that for that external user to prevent from getting that access to that file. So number of ways you can get inside your SharePoint at a file level or a folder level to be able to control access from this interface, or simply just by going into any file inside your document libraries. So I can just go into any files on that. So as a site owner, you can control that. And then in terms of just kind of finishing off SharePoint very quickly before we move on to the other sections is the control of around how you can kind of make sure that how you can control that invitation model. So either you can do it from a user generated perspective, so that any member of the SharePoint team site or that member of that team chat space can share it externally, or simply just keep it at a site owner level itself. So being able to then control that only site owner can do that. So you can do that, or the third one is just simply keeping it at admin level so that only the have it partner users, if you like, for the entire all the users in that one partner organization. So you can use that the kind of the entitlement for that. If I quickly just show you in terms of that part. So if I go into so this is the part in the SharePoint itself, how you can control whether it's site owners and members, or simply just have the site owners share that externally. So by default, it's obviously everyone in the site can share externally, but there's a settings for that you can control for that. Okay. I've put in some slides in here in order to kind of just to have the links in there. So if there are issues in accessing files or folders, sometimes you have people using different browsers with different accounts that they logged in, and so sometimes they get access denied or why you need access to it. So you have all those reasonings as to why that happens and the resolutions to that as well. So worth taking a look from that perspective. And then, of course, if you want to then be able to audit some of these activities in terms of what's been shared externally, then these are some of the events that are recorded in that audit. So if you go to the compliance center within the audit section, then you can actually search across all the audit histories for that particular site or users or in a particular file, and you can create those. You can actually look at those events in terms of what's been added as well. So a handy little guide there as well. Teams, again, Teams being part of it, and that's pretty much very much what's being used these days. The first thing that I log in anyway, that's pretty much what I do within Teams. But these are just some of the areas to think about. I won't go in great detail within the actual Teams admin center, but a few areas to pick on here is that guest access on the right hand side, whereby you only not just controlling access to the content side of things, but the meeting experiences as well as some of the messaging that goes on inside in terms of chats, conversations, or even just using the GIFs or whatever around that. So you can control what the guest can or can't do. But also the other areas to consider there is that if you do a live events type thing, so I, for example, organize the, as I mentioned, the M365 UK. So I use Teams for that. And here every time I organize a new event, then I simply select the everyone option in the live event policies there, which is set by as a one-off. so that every time I create a new event, I can make that public event that anyone on the planet can actually join that event. So you can control that in terms of that from external sharing experience, but also controlling those file sharing as well using the other cloud file storage providers. So it's just something to bear in mind on that. And then Dataverse, which is the new kid or it's been the CDS renamed from that, but essentially I call that database and teams. And for every team that you have, you can create your Dataverse as its own database. A couple of things to bear in mind here is that the teams that the guests you invite, they will be able to access not just the apps, bots, and flows, but all the data, but only from their perspective. So they can only see their own records and not anybody else's. Um, just seems a bit bizarre as to, if you got one database solution in there, being able to see all those records, why would you not see other records? So it's just something to bear in mind that, they'll be able to view all the resources within that, but only a particular set of records that they've created within that. So there's the example of like the employee ideas solution that you can get within that. And then in terms of understanding that, just brief from the experience, whether it's Azure Active Directory that we started off with, or if you just use Microsoft Teams to control your guest access, or whether you go inside SharePoint, doesn't matter. But in terms of from the left hand side, it's more from an admin experience in terms of if the guest is not present in your tenant, then they'll never get access to the tenant itself. But if you do decide to then obviously send that guest invite, then here the kind of checks that it makes is that whether SharePoint, for example, allows external sharing or not. That's the organization level that we had a look just now, all the way down to the site level. And if that is correct, then obviously files access is granted, and then it moves on to the teams, and then being able to give that user access to your the apps or tabs inside your teams itself to be able to work collaboratively on that. So again, this kind of gives you a view, and there's a link there as well that gives you some of those dependencies that you can control to be able to successfully authorize the guest access. I mentioned briefly that by default, when you do create all your teams, whether you like it or not, guest access can be is enabled for all your teams. But if you have a specific team that you just want to restrict from guest access altogether, and there is no GUI for this, there's no admin interface for it, then you essentially would use a PowerShell script. And here's the one that I use in order to control that, so that only a specific group can be shared. But again, for SharePoint, you would have to go into your SharePoint admin center, or of course you could run PowerShell scripts there as well as a package script, if you like, so that you can disable external sharing and disable the guest access there as well. And then Planner, just again is more from an experience perspective in terms of what they can or what they can't do. So things like, again, they can't create a plan, as in one team for one planner. They can't create multiple plans within that, or delete the plans either. So they can edit the name of the plan. So that's the one to kind of watch out for. But also if there's any public plans or any public groups, Microsoft 365 groups, then they will be able to view all those plans as well from that, because pretty much everyone's got access on that. Yammer, very light on Yammer on this particular side of things. That experience is no different to what's been around. But again, it's something to be mindful of. If part of your Microsoft 365, if you have got Yammer enabled for your users, then these are the areas to bear in mind in terms of Yammer connected Microsoft 365 groups, but also being able to then control that external networks and being able to disable some of the conversations, if you like, within the Yammer itself. And then one part I want to quickly touch is being able to having all the collaboration going on, and you got many guests now that happening, and that's part of the governance to be able to monitor that should they even be in there or not. So one of the things you can take advantage of is the access reviews, which is obviously in kind of preview, but obviously it requires Azure AD premium license. So you can see the details there in terms of what you can. But let me just show you that what that looks like. So if I go over to admin, just conscious of time, we've got about 5 minutes, so we're nearly there. But if I go to portalazure.com, so if I go back to where I was, which was in external settings, collaborate, external identities, and access reviews. So this is an area which is kind of, been there for some time in terms of its preview. But here I can actually set up my access reviews in terms of what to monitor and what not. So it's not just for guests, it's for everyone as well if you wanted to. So in this case, I can go into say that I want to review teams and groups, or I could do applications. And then I can say select which teams. So I can say I'll select a particular team, and I might have a confidential project in there, for example, that I want to see what's going on. I'll pick Market project team there, select that one. And then I can say, what's my scope of review? Is it just the guest users or everyone in that team? I'll just say guest users only. And then I can choose my kind of parameters around in terms of who the reviewers are. So I can say group owners or selected users. In fact, I'll probably just go to group owners. And then I can choose my recurrence from that if I want to do that quarterly and, on the duration wise, 25 days. And to what date do I want to do that review all the time? So you got far more flexibility there to be able to set up your reviews based on that frequency. Do bear in mind that obviously if you're going to set somebody as a reviewer, then they need that Azure P2 license as well as the members for that who's going to be setting up the access reviews. And then you can just go into that settings area in terms of what happens. If somebody doesn't respond to that review, then what do you want to do? Do you want to remove their access straight away? Or do you want to just take recommendations based on the feedback you may get? But also being able to either block users from signing in for 30 days or so. So you got those settings there. And also if somebody says, if there's a justification required, you can have that enabled as well. So keeping that kind of dialogue fairly smooth if you like. But once you kind of set up those settings there, then you can just quickly look at that, summarize, and just go ahead and create by giving that name of the review. So you have that way to really actively now monitor in terms of your guest experiences, your guests inside your tenant from that perspective. So kind of a very quick overview on the monitoring guests side of things. And then you got other areas to look, kind of consider as well, just outside of Teams and SharePoint side of things. So you got your calendar in there as well if you want to make those available for people or anybody out there to view the busy or in free times. Also the apps as well, being able to access third-party apps, whether you want to have users consenting using their organization account or whether you want to control that to the admin. And that's the most recommended way of doing it. So the admin takes charge, set up that kind of a central management processes around that. But also being able to control whether users can access the Office store and add-ins or trial apps and services. Microsoft Forms, you can make available the link as an anonymous link to the forms for feedback, for example. Again, that's you can control whether it should be available externally or not. Sway, yeah, again, you can have information presented in a nicer ways, but again, keeping an eye on whether you want to use some of the trusted sources to input things into Sway or some of the information you may have inside your organization that potentially may go out in the Sway as well. There is obviously a lot more improvements there as well. One of the key areas there is that if you're a large organization and you have a partner that you're working with who may have hundreds and thousands of staff, you don't want to set those up individually. So for that, you would create that B2B extranet space, if you like, in order to control that experience and the administrative overheads. But hopefully, you can take a look at some of these links, including setting up that secure Teams guest access environment, as well as being able to look at the interactions between Teams, SharePoint, some of the things that I've talked you through in terms of how that interrelates together. So yeah, so hopefully that's kind of everything that I wanted to cover off in terms of external sharing in Microsoft 365. And I'm sure there's a lot more that I could do this, but obviously I'll take the questions or any views or thoughts that you may have, then that would be excellent. But just want to say thanks to Galen, Ryan, and Joel, as well as the members in the community organizers. But here's a couple of events I'm speaking, one next week and one end of February. So if you can, do join, and you can find my details on techchirag.com. So thanks very much, everyone.